The man history called the greatest traitor who ever lived was in fact the only person in the room who actually understood what was happening. Not one of the 12. Not the priests who condemned the prisoner. Not the Roman soldiers who drove the nails. Only Judas knew. And because he knew, he had to do what none of the others could bring themselves to do. And because he did it, 2,000 years of civilization buried his name so deep into the architecture of evil that his very existence became a warning. Do not be Judas. Do not betray. Do not sell your friend for silver. But what if the silver was never the point? What if the betrayal was never a betrayal at all? What if there is a gospel, a second account of the same events written in the same era by people who were there, and in that gospel, Jesus pulls Judas aside and says, "You are the only one I trust with this. You are the only one capable of doing what must be done." That gospel exists. It was buried in a cave in Egypt for 1,700 years, and when it finally surfaced, the people who found it very nearly destroyed it before anyone could read a single word. If you're somewhere in the States right now, late into the evening, drop your state and the time below. I want to know who else is awake for this one. The limestone hills of Jebel Karara rise out of the Middle Egyptian flatlands like the spine of something that died a long time ago, pale and enormous against the brown sky. The kind of landscape that swallows sound. Near the city of Alminia, where the Nile bends and the desert presses close against its banks, a group of local men, poor men who knew these hills the way their fathers and grandfathers had known them, cut into the rock face sometime around 1978 and found a cave. Inside the cave was a sealed stone box. Inside the box was a leather-bound codex, a book, ancient and fragile, its pages the color of dried skin, brittle at the edges, but intact. Impossibly, miraculously, intact. The men had no way of knowing what they held. They had no way of knowing that the pages inside that leather cover contained a text that a 2nd century bishop named Irenaeus had declared to be demonic, that it had been hunted for nearly 2 millennia, copied only once and then buried, and that the single surviving copy was now in their hands, crumbling slightly in the Egyptian afternoon heat. They did what men in their position do. They sold it. What followed was not a discovery. It was a crucifixion of paper. The codex passed from local dealers operating under pseudonyms into the subterranean economy of the global antiquities black market, wrapped carelessly in modern newspaper, the ancient organic fibers of the papyrus grinding against newsprint headlines as it moved through hands that understood only its price, not its content. By the time it reached the legitimate market in 1984, it had already suffered damage that would take decades of forensic restoration to partially reverse. And then it stopped moving entirely. For 16 years, from March 1984 to April 2000, the sole surviving copy of the Gospel of Judas sat inside a safe deposit box at a Citibank branch in Hicksville, New York, in a climate no one had calibrated for ancient papyrus, the humidity fluctuating across the seasons, the organic fibers slowly exhaling the moisture that had kept them cohesive for 17 centuries. This is not a metaphor, yet, though it will become one. This is just what happened to the physical object. And what happened to the physical object, it turns out, is the perfect diagram of what happened to the theology it contained. When the codex finally emerged from the vault, it passed through the hands of an American antiquities dealer named Bruce Farini, who made a decision so catastrophic and so strange that papyrologists would later struggle to explain it with anything other than the word accident. Farini subjected the ancient manuscript to deep freezing. The molecular destruction was immediate and total. The organic sap that had held the papyrus fibers together since approximately 300 AD, the binding material that had survived the Nile floods, the Roman Empire, the rise and fall of Byzantium, and 17 centuries of Egyptian darkness, dissolved. As the frozen moisture sublimated, it forced the ancient ink to migrate outward from the fiber surface. Pages that had held legible text for nearly 2 millennia took on what later papyrologists described as a sandblasted appearance, letters dissolving into dust, entire passages collapsing into illegibility at the slightest pressure of a human fingertip. The text that nearly destroyed itself before anyone could read it was, appropriately, about suppression, about a truth that powerful institutions required to remain unknown, about the systematic burial of an alternative account that, if circulated widely, would have destabilized the foundation of the largest religious empire the Western world had ever produced. The man who understood this first was not a scholar. He was a bishop named Irenaeus of Lyon, writing in approximately 180 AD, roughly a century after the events described in the canonical Gospels, and roughly a century before the physical codex would be sealed into that Egyptian cave. In his foundational treatise Against Heresies, Irenaeus did not argue against Gnostic theology. He hunted it. His language is not the language of theological debate. It is the language of extermination. He declared his explicit intention to expose the wild beast to view, to inflict wounds upon it from every side until the doctrine was dead. And among the specific texts he targeted, he named the Gospel of Judas directly, describing it as a fictitious history produced by people who had inverted the entire moral architecture of the Christian story. This is the detail that should stop you cold. Irenaeus knew about the Gospel of Judas in 180 AD, which means the text was circulating widely enough and was considered threatening enough that the emerging Orthodox Church felt it necessary to name it explicitly as a target for theological destruction. The text was not marginal. It was dangerous. And the institution that felt most threatened by it was also the institution that would, within the next 2 centuries, gain the political authority to decide which texts survived and which ones didn't. What Irenaeus could not do with arguments, the weight of an empire would eventually do with silence. The codex was sealed. The truth it contained was sealed with it, and for the next 1700 years, the only Judas anyone knew was the Judas of 30 pieces of silver, the Judas of greed, the Judas whose name became a word for betrayal in every language that descended from the Western tradition. But sealed is not destroyed. Buried is not dead. And the text in that limestone cave was waiting for a world that had the tools to read it and the willingness to consider what it said. The restoration of the Codex Chakos, which is the formal name of the manuscript that houses the Gospel of Judas alongside 3 other Gnostic texts, took years of painstaking forensic labor. Scholars working under Rodolphe Kasser and Marvin Meyer reassembled thousands of fragments using infrared photography, multispectral imaging, and techniques borrowed from crime scene reconstruction. By 2006, enough of the text had been recovered to publish a first translation. And what that translation revealed was not a minor variation on the familiar story. It was a completely different universe. But to understand what the Gospel of Judas actually says, you first have to understand what it is dismantling. And what it is dismantling is not just a story, it is a cosmology, a map of reality itself, one that had been taught to billions of people across 2 millennia as the only map that existed. That map, it turns out, had been drawn by the wrong God. And Judas was the only disciple who knew. There is a moment in the Gospel of Judas that no Orthodox theologian has ever been able to adequately explain away. Jesus approaches his 12 disciples as they are gathered together, performing the Eucharist, blessing bread, reciting prayers, doing everything they have been taught is sacred and correct and pleasing to God. And Jesus watches them. And then he laughs. Not a warm laugh. Not the laughter of a father watching children play. The Greek and Coptic text is precise about the quality of this sound. It is the laughter of something that exists at a sufficient distance from the scene to find the participants' conviction genuinely, cosmically absurd. When the disciples demand to know what he finds funny, Jesus tells them, "I am not laughing at you. You are not doing this because of your own will, but because it is through this that your God will be praised." Your God. Two words that, if you have grown up inside any tradition descended from Orthodox Christianity, land with the force of something structural collapsing. The disciples' God. Not the true God, not the infinite spirit of the universe. The disciples are praying to someone, and that someone is not who they think it is. The Sethian Gnostic cosmology that animates every page of the Gospel of Judas is built on a premise so radical that the institutional church required an entire bureaucracy of heresiologists to suppress it. The premise is this: the God who created the material world is not the highest divine being. He is a subordinate, an accident, an arrogant lower entity who confused himself with the ultimate reality and built a universe out of that confusion. His name in the text is Saklas. In Aramaic, the word means the fool. The material world in this framework is not a gift, it is a prison. The architecture of biological life, bone and blood and nervous system, was engineered by Saklas and his administrators, the archons, as a mechanism of containment. Somewhere inside each human body, according to Sethian cosmology, there is a fragment of genuine divine light, a pneuma, a spark of the true transcendent God, which descended into matter and became trapped. The archons want it to stay trapped. Every mechanism of the material world, death, reincarnation, the stars themselves, works to keep the pneuma confused about its origin and unable to ascend back to the pleroma, the realm of genuine divine fullness that exists above and beyond Saklas's simulation entirely. The 12 disciples, in this reading, are not merely ignorant, they are worshiping their own jailer. Jesus knows this because Jesus is not from here. The Gospel of Judas is explicit about his origin in a way the canonical texts never are. He comes from the realm of Barbello, the first and purest emanation of the true, unnameable God, a dimension of absolute light that Saklas has never touched and cannot reach. Jesus is an alien consciousness wearing a biological suit, and the biological suit is killing him, not in the sense of physical deterioration, but in the ontological sense. Every second he spends inside a body designed by the fool is a second in which the divine is imprisoned in corruption. He needs to get out. But he cannot simply die. Natural death is a mechanism of the archons. It loops the pneuma back into the material cycle. He needs something specific. A violent, deliberate, precisely choreographed breach of the biological cage, one that will allow his divine consciousness to escape the simulation entirely, rather than being recycled by it. For this, he needs the only disciple who understands any of this, and so he singles him out. The scene in the Gospel of Judas, where Jesus identifies Judas as the unique initiate, is staged as a kind of test. He issues a challenge to the assembled 12, asking whether any of them is strong enough to stand before his true face and know what they are looking at. 11 of them rush forward with the blind confidence of people who have never genuinely interrogated their own certainty. And one by one, they cannot hold it. They fall back. Their spirits buckle under the weight of the actual divine. They are incapable of what they were certain they could do. Judas steps forward last, and even he, even the one who will prove capable, has to turn his face away, The text says he looks aside before he can speak. But he speaks. He says, "I know who you are and where you have come from. You are from the immortal realm of Barbello, and I am not worthy to utter the name of the one who has sent you." This confession, in the logic of the text, eclipses every canonical confession in the New Testament. Peter's famous declaration in Matthew, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," identifies Jesus as the fulfillment of a Jewish messianic tradition rooted in the created world, sent by the Creator God, operating within the framework of the very cosmology the Gospel of Judas is dismantling. Judas's confession operates on a different plane entirely. He names the specific realm. He names the alien origin. He understands that the figure standing before him has no genuine connection to the material world or its creator at all. Jesus responds by pulling Judas aside. The conversation that follows, the private instruction, the secret commandment, is the fulcrum on which the entire narrative balances, and it is where the Gospel of Judas becomes, depending on how you read it, either the most heretical document in the history of Christianity or the most profound act of theological mercy ever recorded. Jesus tells Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." The phrase in the Coptic original, "the man that clothes me," is one of the most precisely chosen formulations in the entire text. Clothes. Not inhabits, not animates, not fills with divine light. Clothes. The body is an article of garment. It is something put on over the self, not something that constitutes the self. And what Judas is being asked to do is not commit a crime. He is being asked to assist in the removal of a garment that has become a cage. This is not, it must be said, an easy role to accept. The text does not pretend otherwise. Jesus does not offer Judas comfort or reassurance about how history will treat him. He offers him something considerably darker, the truth about what the act will cost. And here is the thing that neither the Orthodox tradition nor the initial National Geographic translation of the text wanted to sit with. Jesus calls Judas the 13th Demon. Not the 13th Spirit, as the first translation softened it. Demon. The scholar, April DeConnick, whose close linguistic analysis of the Coptic original fundamentally changed the academic conversation around this text, demonstrated that in 2nd century Jewish and Gnostic contexts, the Greek loanword daimon carried an unambiguously dark and malevolent connotation. There was no neutral reading available to the original audience. Jesus is not flattering Judas with an exotic title. He is telling him exactly what he will have to become. 13. The number outside the zodiac circle of 12. The number that stands at the edge of the archonic system, not inside it, not bound by its rules, but close enough to reach in and break something. To step into the role of the 13th means to operate in the dark zone between the celestial system and its subversion. It means to look like an agent of the archons from the outside while working against them from within. It means to absorb the hatred and the curse of the entire terrestrial world, and to do it consciously, with full knowledge of the cost. The injustice at the center of this story is so precise it feels designed. The other 11 disciples will be rewarded by the material world for serving its creator. They will be venerated, canonized, their names carved into stone above altars in buildings that will stand for 1,000 years. Their stories will be told to children as exemplars of devotion, courage, and spiritual clarity. Judas will absorb every sin they refuse to name. He will become the face of greed, of treachery, of the most intimate kind of moral failure a human being can commit. His name will become a category of person, a warning, an insult. And this is not an accident of history. It is the exact and predicted outcome of the role he accepted. The 11 are canonized because they serve Saklas. The material world rewards those who maintain its architecture. Judas is condemned because he serves the true God. And the true God does not operate through the mechanisms of earthly reputation. There is a psychological pattern here that the Gospel of Judas never names directly, but makes impossible to miss. It is the pattern of the person who understands the real situation so completely that they can no longer participate in the collective performance of not knowing. The one who sees through the institutional mythology clearly enough to act in a way that serves the deeper truth rather than the surface consensus. These people, in every era and every context, are reliably, systematically punished by the institutions they see through. Not because they are wrong, but because their clarity makes the illusion visible to everyone around them. And the illusion is what the institution runs on. Judas is the earliest and most complete portrait of this archetype in the Western canon. And what he does next, he does with complete, terrible, clear-eyed comprehension of what it will cost him. Before Judas descends to the earth for the last time, he looks up. The Gospel of Judas gives him a vision, and the vision comes in the form of a dream he recounts to Jesus, a psychic pre-experience of everything that is about to happen. In the dream, Judas sees the 12 disciples. They are stoning him. The rocks fly from their hands with the specific, practiced force of people who have decided that the person in front of them is not really a person at all, but a category of wrong that the community has agreed to expel. The stoning is not spontaneous mob violence. It is structured. It is collective. It is the enforcement of a consensus about who belongs and who doesn't. This dream is not about the future as a calendar event. It is about the already existing reality of what Judas's position is. He has been outside the 12 from the moment he understood what the 12 did not. The stones in the dream are the theological condemnations that have already been forming in the minds of the disciples who cannot hold their gaze on the true face of Christ. The stones are Irenaeus's treatises, already being drafted in some future century. The stones are every sermon that will use his name as an example of what a person becomes when greed supplants devotion. He dreams the future because the future has already decided what to do with him. Jesus does not comfort him. This matters enormously. He does not say, "Do not worry, history will vindicate you." He does not promise earthly rehabilitation. He offers something else entirely, something that operates on a different axis from reputation and memory and historical record. He says, "Lift up your eyes and look at the cloud and the light within it, and the stars surrounding it. The star that leads the way is your star." The star. Not a metaphor for hope in the soft sense that word is collapsed into in modern usage. In Sethian cosmology, the stars are deeply ambiguous objects. They are, for most human beings, archonic machinery. The 12 signs of the zodiac map directly onto the 12 lower rulers who administer the material realm, who govern the cycles of birth and death and reincarnation that keep the pneuma trapped in biological repetition. For most of the 12 disciples, their stars are the stars of the system. They are bound by the celestial architecture of the material prison. But Judas's star is different. It leads the way. It does not govern a material cycle. It points out and up, past the zodiac, past the archonic administration, toward the light cloud that exists beyond the system entirely. His star is the marker of an exception. It is the indicator of someone the archonic map was not designed to contain. And then Judas lifts his eyes, and he sees it. The luminous cloud, and he enters it. The text says the crowd of people on the ground can hear a voice speaking from inside the cloud, the voice of the holy generation, the pre-existent, incorruptible lineage of pneumatic beings who exist in the pleroma. but they cannot see what Judas sees. The crowd is still on the earth. Judas is in the light. What happens next in the Gospel of Judas is perhaps the most jarring narrative transition in ancient literature. The text drops without ceremony from this blinding, transcendent vision of cosmic apotheosis back to the ground. Priests murmur together in a guest room. There is a problem, they say, with a man who has been gathering crowds. Judas appears. He is alone, separated from the other disciples, isolated in exactly the way the Gnostic theology predicts the initiate will always be isolated. He speaks to the priests. He answers them as they wished. He receives the money. He hands Jesus over. The operation is complete. The biological cage is breached. The text ends here. There is no resurrection scene in the Gospel of Judas, at least not in any form that has survived the physical destruction of the Codex. The pages were too badly damaged. What we have is a story that climaxes in the deliberate, conscious, fully comprehended sacrifice of a man who understood exactly what he was doing, and exactly what it would cost him. Followed by a narrative silence so absolute, it feels like the silence after a very large door closes. Now consider what the Orthodox tradition built in that silence. The institution that Irenaeus was protecting required a specific kind of Judas. It required a Judas who is motivated by money, because greed is a sin that the community can expel and thereby maintain its own moral cleanliness. It required a Judas who was possessed by a devil, because possession externalizes the evil and removes the uncomfortable possibility that a person might choose to participate in the death of the Savior for reasons that were not base, but were, in some deeply troubling sense, correct. It required a Judas who despaired and died by suicide, because despair after transgression is the appropriate narrative conclusion for a sinner who recognizes his sin too late. This Judas is useful. He is a cautionary figure. He serves the institutional story. The Gnostic Judas is not useful in this way. The Gnostic Judas is not a warning. He is an indictment. Not of himself, but of the entire system that condemned him. He does not betray out of greed. He acts out of understanding. He does not despair. He ascends. He does not die as the lowest character in the story. He executes the most important operation in the story, knowingly, deliberately, at an unimaginable personal cost, for reasons that the institution had every structural incentive to ensure no one would ever hear. The question that the Gospel of Judas drops into the modern mind and refuses to pick back up is whether the difference between a traitor and a martyr is the story that survives. The codex was frozen. The pages crumbled. The text was nearly lost, not once, but repeatedly, across 17 centuries of suppression, mishandling, negligence, and deliberate destruction. And yet enough of it survived. Enough words held their shape through the sand-blasting and the freezing and the black market transit and the fluctuating humidity of the Long Island vault. Enough text survived to reconstitute the argument that the most powerful religious institution in the history of the Western world once decided it could not afford to let circulate. And what that text asks, in its last recovered pages, is a question that has no comfortable answer. Not a theological question, a human one. What do you do when the true act and the right act look, from the outside, completely identical to the wrong act? What do you do when executing the divine directive requires you to accept, permanently and irrevocably, the identity of the villain? What do you do when the only person who will ever know the truth of your motivation is the one person you had to sacrifice to prove it? Judas stood in the threshold between the cloud and the ground. He looked up and saw his star. And then he came back down. He came back down because the work was not done yet. The vision was real. The star was real. the luminous cloud, was real. And none of it could be reached without passing first through the act that would make his name a synonym for treachery in every language descended from the tradition he was completing. He walked across the threshold. He answered the priests as they wished. He received the coins, not because he wanted them, but because that is what the transaction looked like from the outside, and the outside was the only record that would survive. The Orthodox Church built a 2,000-year empire on the story of what Judas did. It built it on the interpretation that served the institution. It carved that interpretation into stone above its altars, taught it to its children, used it to define the outer edge of human moral failure. And in a cave in the limestone hills of Middle Egypt, the other story waited. It waited in the dark, the way the truth usually does, until someone was ready to look at it without flinching. Here is the irony buried in the structure of this story that 2,000 years of telling it the Orthodox way has prevented anyone from naming directly. The Gospel of Judas argues that Judas was the most devoted disciple, the most knowledgeable, the most willing to serve at an absolute personal cost. And the evidence for this devotion is the single act that got him expelled from every moral category the tradition was capable of imagining. His greatest act of loyalty looks, from every available external angle, like the ultimate act of betrayal. And because the external angle is the only angle that survived, the loyalty and the betrayal became indistinguishable. Which means the 2,000-year story of Judas as the archetype of treachery is simultaneously, if the Gnostic account is accurate, the 2,000-year story of the most complete devotion ever recorded. Same act, same 30 coins, same garden at night, different understanding of what it was for. You have felt this, not at this scale, not with these stakes, but you have felt the specific texture of this particular experience. The moment when the right thing and the recognizable thing diverge so completely that choosing the right thing requires accepting that no one watching will be able to tell the difference. The moment when the person who matters most to you witnesses the worst version of an act whose true intention you cannot explain without undermining the act itself. The moment when the only evidence of your integrity is something that looks, from the outside, like its opposite. That feeling is 2,000 years old. It has a gospel. It was buried in a cave in Egypt for 1,700 years, and it very nearly crumbled to dust before anyone could read it. Here is the question the Gospel of Judas refuses to answer for you, and you should not let it off the hook. If you had been the one who understood, really understood the necessity of the act, and you knew that executing it meant accepting permanent designation as history's ultimate villain, and you knew the designation would last not years, but millennia, and you knew that not a single person among the billions who would despise your name would have access to any information that might allow them to read the act differently, would you have the obedience or the arrogance to do it anyway? And here is the thread the Gospel of Judas leaves deliberately unresolved. The loose end it hides in the very last lines of the recovered text, the one that should keep you awake. The priests who received Judas in the guest room are described as puzzled. They had a problem they could not solve on their own. A man who gathered crowds in a way that threatened their authority. And then Judas appeared, alone, separated from the other disciples, and solved it for them. The text does not tell us whether they understood, even in that moment, what they were actually part of. Whether the soldiers who came later understood. Whether Pilate understood. Whether anyone in the terrestrial apparatus, from the priests to the empire, ever grasped that they were the instruments of a cosmic operation they had no vocabulary to name. The archons, in Gnostic cosmology, do not understand what they are administering. They are not evil in the way that requires intelligence. They are evil in the way that requires only certainty combined with ignorance, the specific combination that has always been the most efficient engine of destruction in human history. The archons are still administering. The institutions built on the certainty of the Orthodox account are still operational. They still have the same structural incentive to suppress any account of events that would require them to revise the story their authority depends on. The Gospel of Judas survived. Barely, catastrophically, against every conceivable odd, it survived. What you do with that survival is the question the Codex was waiting 1700 years to ask you.